radio shows, seeing these recreations of these shows. Yeah. Okay, we continue. Done on television, seeing some of these radio recreations done on TV with folks reading these, standing before microphones, reading these scripts. Okay, I guess the whole point of the story is that radio in its infancy was just like Zoom is today, waiting for folks to make their connections, losing the connections, glitches and all. That was the whole point of the story. But I go off on these tangents, and even the radio thing was a tangent as well. But so yes, we're present at the creation. The Dean Acheson's biography of his life in public service. Dean Acheson was the Secretary of State under Harry Truman, present at the creation. So yeah, so that's what we are today, present at the creation. And I also hold too, this is me putting on my history cap, I hold too that the founding fathers, if you will, were not just those guys who wrote the Declaration of Independence and fought against the British. The founding fathers are you and me. We're founding fathers, founding mothers, founding uncles, brothers, sisters, cousins. We're still writing history. We are still, this country is still being formed. And so look upon yourselves as founding mothers, founding fathers, brothers, sisters, and all that. So yes, and we are creating an America that we're going to pass on to those that who are going to come after us, who are going to succeed us. So that's the way I also like to approach history as well. And I see that some people are there in the sanctuary of the Friends Meeting House. Hello there. Hi there. This is the first time that I have seen the sanctuary, albeit by Zoom, but this is the first time that I have seen the sanctuary inside the Friends Meeting House since, I guess, 2007, 2008, when that was originally the home of St. James Episcopal Church, which is my home parish, St. James Episcopal Church. And something else about that wonderful space, and we were so happy that the Friends Meeting House got that space instead of another more a fundamentalist church. So you all know I'm one of those secular humanists.
You ought to see the kitchen.
Yes. Yeah. I would like to see the kitchen. I will have to visit. Yes. So that I can see the kitchen. I can just barely make it out from the camera position here. But, yeah. But so it's so great to see the what was the sanctuary. The sanctuary. Do you call your meeting space, your big hall, a sanctuary? Or what do you call it?
The meeting room.
No, the meeting room. I'm sorry. Okay, to see your meeting room, which was our sanctuary, formerly our sanctuary, to see your meeting room for the first time, how wonderful that is. Well, I will have to make an appearance for sure. Yeah, great. Anyway, also too, where your building is located, those beautiful oak trees that are on that little rise just behind your building or just to the east of your building, we had parishioners who told me that they played under those trees when they were children. And I'm speaking, and some of these parishioners were our founding members of St. James Episcopal Church. Eliza Lee and Laura Love, they were sisters, and they were born in the 1890s. And so as children, at the turn of the 19th century to the 20th century, that they played under those trees when they were children. So back in the day, that was the country. That was the rural part. That was outside of Austin city limits. And also tying this in with some of my roots. Now, I am a native East Austinite, but my mother and my father, dad was born in 1922, mom was born in 1932. They're both deceased. Well, they grew up in eastern Travis County. So, and eastern Travis County was a lot more rural than it is now, even 10 years ago, let alone 66 years ago when I was born. So you could still go out into the country if you traveled east out of Austin city limits on what was used to be East 19th Street, FM 969, East Martin Luther King Jr. Boulevard. So quite a time. And even when I became a member of St. James in '74, still the countryside was maybe only 5 miles east of where your meeting house is now. So things have changed a lot. Things have changed a lot. And so when the parishioners Eliza Lee and Laura Love told me that they once played under those trees, yeah, I could relate, because really, in terms of the connections with East Austin and just the births, it was not that long ago. It was not that long ago, even though we're talking about the turn of the previous century. So yeah, history is like that. History is this wonderful thread that weaves through our lives and the lives of our communities, the lives of the country and the world, but just our personal lives. It's a wonderful interconnectedness that we have, and how we have these links that we can almost, well, in some cases, reach out and touch. And I really appreciate that about history. And to me, that makes history, not just, oh, that stuff that happened in the past, but history is now. History is tomorrow. So, all right. Anyway, though, back to what we're talking about here. East Austin, there has always been, East Austin, when I was growing up, was predominantly a Black community, and also a Mexican American community when I was growing up. And East Austin, as I came to know it, and how most Austinites have come to know it, whether they are native Austinites or Austin transplants. You're Austinites too, by the way. You transplants are Austinites as well. It became a predominantly Black community as a result of the 1928 master plan. The 1928 master plan was the first master plan approved by the city of Austin. And master plans back in the 20s were a new thing, a new way of planning the growth of communities, giving a vision of the future of a community, of a city. And Austin, which has always prided itself on being progressive, however you want to interpret progressive, being on the cutting edge, wanting to be not so much a little provincial city, but more of a place that was looking towards the future, embraced this master plan. And it was one of the first cities, if I'm right, in Texas to embrace a master plan. And so this master plan was drawn up by a firm from Dallas called, some people pronounce it Koch, some say Koch, but Koch, Koch or Koch, and Fowler. They drew up the master plan for the city, and this master plan called for things that we associate with master plans today: improved streets, a better, a better infrastructure, more schools, more neighborhoods, things like that. Well, what made this master plan so unique was that they decided to address what was called back in those days politely the Negro question. Where are Black people going to reside in your city? How can we still, let's say, provide housing for Blacks, but still adhere to the fact that racial segregation in the state is legal? How can we come up with something that would for housing Blacks or prescribing where Blacks could live without it being challenged by the courts? Now, believe it or not, in 1917, there was a housing ordinance in Louisville, Kentucky that proscribed where Blacks were supposed to live. And that housing ordinance was brought to the U.S. Supreme Court, successfully challenged, and the court ruled that the Louisville housing ordinance was unconstitutional, the way it was set up. And so other cities throughout the nation were looking for ways to come up with ways to segregate Blacks from other groups, and without it running afoul of the Supreme Court. So a constitutional way of practicing racial segregation. And of course, we know that back in 1896, the Supreme Court famously ruled in Plessy versus Ferguson that separate but equal was constitutional. So, and that set about even more attempts. There were attempts before that to limit where Blacks or even other ethnic groups could live. You've heard of restrictive covenants.
Mm-hmm.
You've heard of restrictive covenants,
Yes.
which stated that if you had a home, you couldn't sell your home to, most of the time it was spelled out, Blacks, Mexicans, Jews. You couldn't sell to Jews. Or other groups that you deemed were not appropriate groups to associate with. But because Hyde Park, believe it or not, Hyde Park in 1890, that was Austin's first subdivision, Hyde Park. Hyde Park was a place where you could go to get away from the hustle and bustle of grimy, gritty downtown Austin, or grimy, gritty Austin circa 1890. Austin had probably 20,000 people in 1890. But if you moved out to Hyde Park, you could get away, move out to the suburbs. You'd be served by a trolley line, and you would get away from all of the worries of living in the big, dirty 20,000 population city of Austin, Texas. Well, the Hyde Park, one of the appeals of Hyde Park was that, and it was stated in the advertisements, no Negroes. You would not be living with any Negroes if you live in Hyde Park.
Mm.
Now, so what does that tell you about what things were like in Austin in 1890?
Not good.
Yeah. And what does that tell you too? That, okay, if you could go to this enclave where you wouldn't face the idea of the reality of living with Negroes, well then apparently in the hustle and bustle of that grimy, gritty 20,000 population city of Austin, there must have been whites and Negroes living, if not side by side, living within a few neighborhoods of one another. And that was the case. That absolutely was the case. There has been a Black presence in Austin going back to 1839 with the arrival of Mahala Murchison, a 10-year-old black woman, a Black girl who was owned by the Murchison family. Think Murchison School. Anyway, they settled in what is now South Austin, and Mahala Murchison was the first registered Black person in Austin. But then, Austin was the new capital of the Republic of Texas. Well, by 1842, Austin had about maybe 900 people, of which a third of them were Black people, and they were in servitude. There was a very, very tiny free Black population here in Austin. By 1863, for instance, during the midst of the Civil War, and Texas voted to secede and join the Confederacy. Well, there were, even though Travis County voted not to secede and join the Confederacy, voted to stay in the Union, still there were slaves. Austin, a lot of the folks who even voted against secession held slaves here in Austin. So anyway, there were about maybe 10 free Blacks in Austin in 1863, including a man named Henry G. Madison. Henry G. Madison came to Austin as a free man in 1863 during the Civil War, and Henry G. Madison built a cabin. And the cabin was located over at 807 East 11th Street in East Austin. I mention him because he figures prominently in Austin's history, Henry G. Madison. There were, at the end of the Civil War, 1865, Blacks were freed. Well, there was a lot of lawlessness on the Texas frontier, and lawlessness in Austin and outside of Austin. A number of Blacks decided to come together and form their own neighborhoods, their own enclaves that became known as freedmen's communities or freed towns. And there were all let's say, by the turn of the 19th century to the 20th century, there were at least 15 to 18 freedmen's communities in the Austin area. And these freedmen's communities were gathered they were all over Austin. There were some, to be sure, in East Austin, what is known as East Austin, but there were freedmen's communities outside of East Austin. There were freedmen's communities in South Austin, freedmen's communities south of Austin. There were communities in downtown. Do you know that Red River at one time contained a freedmen's community? That's right, Red River Street. The freedmen's community started around, let's say, 8th and Red River and stretched north to, let's say, what's now perhaps 15th and Red River. Some would even say up to what became 19th Street and Red River. But there was a freedmen's community over there. In fact, the only visible evidence that there was once a freedmen's community over there is a structure at the corner of East 11th Street and Red River. That is the administrative home of the Austin Symphony Orchestra.
Correct.
And this is a triangular building, 2-story triangular building. We know of it as the home of the Austin Symphony. The Austin Symphony Orchestra proudly recognizes it and boasts that it was the home of Jeremiah Hamilton. Jeremiah Hamilton was a free Black man. He was in slavery, but came to Texas after the Civil War, settled in Austin, and became involved in politics. And at one time, he served in the Texas legislature during Reconstruction. He served one term in the legislature. And this was back when the state capitol building, the President's state capitol building was not standing. Our President's state capitol building was first completed in 1888, started in 1881, completed in 1888, because it replaced our original capitol building, which was a 3-story brick structure that was built 1853 and burned to the ground in 1881. So that necessitated the building of our present state capitol building. So Jeremiah Hamilton would have served in the old Texas State Capitol building. Some of you, I'm sure, all of you have seen pictures of the old state capitol building. Well, Jeremiah Hamilton decided after serving in the legislature that he would settle in Austin, and so he lived in the Red River community in this two-story triangular house at the corner of East 11th and Red River Street. That is now recognized as is only one of maybe 3 triangular houses in the state of Texas, and it is a state historic landmark. I'm surprised it's not in the National Register of Historic Places, but it is a state historic landmark, and that is perhaps your only evidence left of the fact that there was once a freed community of Black people along Red River Street. And now, if you went below Red River Street back in the day, you would have encountered Germans. Some of you, the German Texas Heritage Society at East 8th and Red River Street. That originally was the German Free School, the first public school, if you will, in the state of Texas, established 1856. The German Free School is a great place to go for doing research on German American history, German families, the German Free School, and occasionally they do live events there as well at the Free School. So yeah, so right below this Black community, you had a German community, and in that German community, well, you had Germans, you had Swedes in that community. Evidence of that community, again, the German Texas Heritage Society, which is in the building that was the German Free School. But also, if you go further south to about, let's say, East 3rd and Red River Street, same street, you've heard of a place called Moonshine.
Yeah.
Okay, Moonshine originally was a German-owned building. It was a general store. That 2-story building was a general store, and it served as a general store. It was in the same families, German families, from 1852 until 1966. And also next door to Moonshine, well, on the same property with Moonshine, there is this small wooden house. Is connected with the Moonshine. Well, that was a German Sunday house. Enterprising Germans back in the day, if you came to town, you did your business in town, usually on Saturdays, you know, as my family used to say, you went trading on Saturdays. Well, then let's say if, in the case if you were German or white, and you didn't want to make the trip, you came from the country. If you didn't want to make the travel back to the country, well, then you could stay in a Sunday house. And so think of it as an early Airbnb, the Sunday house. The family would also use the Sunday house for, you guessed it, Sunday dinners. They would also use the Sunday house for other special occasions. And that little house that is on the property of Moonshine, that little Sunday house is probably the only authentic Sunday house that we have left in the city of Austin. So you had this Black community in downtown Austin. You also had this predominantly German community in downtown Austin. You know, they lived like one, not necessarily side by side, weren't integrated, but they were these 2 enclaves, and they certainly would have interacted with one another. There was once a sizable Black population that lived in downtown Austin. Some of our oldest churches in the city are African American churches. Wesley United Methodist Church over on San Bernard Street, which San Bernard over in East Austin started out as a German community in 1874. And the oldest standing structure on San Bernard is a home from 1877, which is now the home of a black sorority house. Well, anyway, Wesley United Methodist Church started out downtown in the basement of the 10th Street Methodist Church at West 10th in Colorado. That was the Methodist church in the city. Well, Wesley started out there in 1865, consisting of parishioners who had worshiped in the 10th Street Methodist Church as slaves. Well, after the Civil War, they wanted the Black Methodists wanted their own church. And so they started Wesley, the first Wesley Methodist Episcopal Church in the basement of 10th Street, I should say Methodist Episcopal Church. And then by 1881, they were able to move out and buy their own property. And so they settled up at East 9th and Trinity Street in downtown Austin. They were on a hill, so they were affectionately known by many people in the community as Old Wesley on the Hill. So it was Wesley Methodist Episcopal Church. Well, in 1929, 1 year after the master plan was approved that designated that a Negro district would be created in East Austin, well, Wesley moved over to San Bernard Street in East Austin and built their present edifice, which is listed in the National Register of Historic Places. Has anybody ever been over to San Bernard Street? Any of you? Okay. All right, then. You have, Joanna. Did you raise your hand, Hannah? Okay. Anyway, though, for those who have been to San Bernard, I'm sure you've seen Wesley United Methodist Church over there. For those of you, let's see here. Let me just check one thing. Hold on 1 second.
His office looks like his.
You all familiar with the magazine Tribesa?
Yep.
All right then. This is the neighborhood issue. Tribesa magazine. This is their neighborhoods issue. This is the latest issue on the stands. Now this shows you, they highlight historic churches in the city. And this is the sanctuary, the interior of Wesley United Methodist Church on San Bernard, built 1929. It is in the National Register of Historic Places. It was, when I was a boy, if you were a member of Wesley United Methodist Church, it was a mark of social distinction. If you were a member of that church, you were worshiping among the, quote, cream of the crop, if you will, in the Black community. If you were at Wesley, or if you were at David Chapel Baptist Church, or if you were at Ebenezer Baptist Church, you were people in the Black community. They knew that you were about something, where you worship. But anyway, though, this is a beautiful church, beautiful sanctuary, and I commend you to go over to San Bernard and check out Wesley United Methodist Church and check out the houses along San Bernard. There's another beautiful church over there on San Bernard, Olivet Baptist Church, which was designed by the first Black person to graduate from the School of Architecture from the University of Texas in 1952. His name was John Chase. John Chase went on to design not only Olivet Baptist Church on San Bernard, but he also went on to design David Chapel Missionary Baptist Church on East Martin Luther King Jr. Boulevard. He designed several buildings on the campus of Texas Southern University in Houston. He also designed a parking garage for his old alma mater, the University of Texas at Austin. as well. He also designed an embassy in the Middle East. He designed a number of private residences in East Austin too. He was from Houston, and he went back to Houston and set up his practice in, I think it was the 4th Ward in Houston. And he was a world-renowned architect, and he set up his practice, went back to the hood, the neighborhood, to set up his practice so as to serve as an example for aspiring young architects in the community, that they too could make it, they too could be successful like he was. So quite a remarkable man, John S. Chase. So Wesley was once in this Red River community, which also took in East 9th and Trinity Street. There were other First Colored Baptist Church was in that Red River community after originally being located further downtown in the block at the southwest corner of Guadalupe and West 8th Street. No, Guadalupe and West 9th Street, where you have the Austin Public Library, where you have the Austin History Center located right now, which was originally the Austin Public Library, and next door to that, what was the John Henry Falk Austin Public Library. So you had on that corner, you had 2 black churches. You had First Colored Baptist Church, or First Baptist Church Colored, and you also had Metropolitan African Methodist Episcopal Church, which Metropolitan, by the way, they were located at one time, they were located on another portion of that same block where First Baptist Church Colored was located, but there was also a Swedish Lutheran church located in that same block. And so the Swedish Lutheran Church, they sold their building to the congregation of Metropolitan African Methodist Episcopal Church. And so they took over that church, and both of these churches were located right across from a block that was dedicated to be a public square, according to the 1839 layout of Austin, Texas. It was to have been one of 4 original town squares. But at the time that these 2 churches were located there, this town square was being used as a dump. This square was being used as a dump. And there was and it was actually, the state took it over and they owned the square, and it was being used as a public dump. And this is just really, think about this. This is like next to some churches. This is really a few blocks away from that impressive new state capitol building that was completed in 1888.
Mm.
And so it took the negotiations of city leaders with the state to get a lease on that town square so that it could be made into a town square and not used as a dump. Among those who negotiated the use of the repurposing of that town of that dump as a town square was some guy named Mayor Alexander P. Woolridge. Does that name ring a bell with anybody?
Mm-hmm.
I just came across that name. No, just joking. Woolridge Park, Alexander P. Woolridge, mayor of Austin. Well, he spearheaded the drive to make that into a town square, and that's how we know of it today, is Woolridge Park. Well, one of those who once spoke at Woolridge Park was a man named Booker T. Washington.
Mm.
That's right. Booker T. Washington, perhaps the best known black person in America, one of the best known black persons in America, he wanted to speak at the Texas State Capitol, but he was denied that opportunity to speak at the Capitol. So the city, black and white leaders got together and made sure that he could speak at Woolridge Square Park. And there was a plaque commemorating that occasion at Woolridge Park now too. So anyway, but again, back to where these churches were located. Blacks lived in downtown Austin. There used to be a community there was the West Avenue community, which took in West Avenue, West 5th Street. There was the community down there. There was the Barton Springs community across the river. In fact, right off of on Woolridge Street, there was once that was once part of the Barton Springs community, and there is today there is a boarded up building that was a church, and that's the Barton Springs Baptist Church. And right behind that church is a much neglected cemetery. So yeah, again, we once lived all over the city. Most people know of Clarksville. Clarksville originally was outside of Austin city limits, west of Austin. Well, eventually the city grew, and eventually they surrounded Clarksville. And in order to try to discourage blacks from staying in Clarksville, they used to dump garbage out in Clarksville. But still blacks persevered and stayed, and they didn't follow the move of so many other blacks over to East Austin with the 1928 master plan. I know I'm jumping around here. I'm trying to stay consistent, trying to weave a thread here. But you had communities in South Austin. You had Kinchinville. The Kinchins is a very prominent family in Austin, black family. And in fact, T.W. Kinchin, Thomas W. Kinchin, I knew of him when he was in real estate. His family was in real estate, and I knew Mr. Kinchin personally. Anyway, his family was from Kinchinville. There was a family of Collins out at Pilot Knob. You've heard of Pilot Knob? That's out near Circuit of the Americas now. Well, do you know this about Pilot Knob? Pilot Knob is an extinct volcano. And believe it or not, Austin has about 11 extinct volcanoes.
No.
That's
Really?
right. Yes. Kind of explains too, our hilly terrain here in Austin. But yeah, we have about 11 extinct volcanoes here, and Pilot Knob was one of them. Now, we're not talking anything gigantic. We're not talking Kilauea or, Mount Fuji, nothing like that. But yeah, we had Pilot Knob out in southeast Travis County. A black community existed out there at one time. In fact, there are still some black families who own property out there in Pilot Knob. It's become quite suburban now, but there are still some black farms in that area. There was black communities again in East Austin already. The most famous being Gregorytown and Masontown. By the way, when Samuel Houston College and when Tillotson colleges were formed, Samuel Houston was chartered 1875, Tillotson chartered 1877. Both schools opened their doors before the University of Texas opened its doors. Anyway, these two black colleges were in East Austin, in a black community, a freedmen's community. And eventually that all became known as Robertson Hill. But these schools were in these two black freedmen's communities. So there were free blacks. I mean, there were blacks living in East Austin, and they were living next, maybe not necessarily side by side, but their communities were adjacent to German communities, to Swedish communities, to Italian communities. And then the Mexican communities. There was once a large Mexican American community that was located downtown around Republic Square Park now. There used to be a pecan shelling factory down there. Well, Our Lady of Guadalupe Church was organized in that particular part of town back about 1907, a church to serve the needs of Mexican American Catholics. And now think about this. This Mexican community, where it was located adjacent to a Black community that once existed in downtown Austin as well. So, and then let me see, you had communities north. Some of you, like if you go up North I-35 and go past the LBJ Presidential Library and Museum, or over in that area, there was another Freedmen's community that was called Horst Pasture. Horst, H-O-R-S-T. Horst, Mr. Horst was a German, and Mr. Horst had German relations, had Black relations. And there were a number of Blacks who lived in, some say it was never a real permanent community because there were no churches in that community, but we have evidence of a community where Blacks lived called Horst Pasture also. So you had a lot of these things going on. These freedmen's communities were established, like I said, after the Civil War, because there was lawlessness on the frontier, lawlessness in Austin. Blacks could be picked up and they could be put into prison gangs for the most minor of infractions like loitering. There was a lot of opposition to free Black people, and so these Blacks set up these communities to, gain a foothold in the community, put their lives back together in the wake of the Civil War and slavery. Also, these communities would be way stations to, let's say, maybe attract families who had been separated because of slavery. Churches were established in these communities. Businesses were established, this being the horse and buggy days, blacksmith shops. There were schools established in these communities as well. And many of these communities were located in a way that where the Black residents would not be far from their white employers. Also, too, Austin being the seat of state government, Blacks looked at opportunities to be employed as porters, to be employed as maintenance people. Austin not only had politicians, Austin also had a lot of attorneys. Gee, that hasn't changed at all, has it? So Blacks sought employment as employers, as servants, as porters to the attorneys, as well as to the legislatures, the politicians in Austin, just to name a few things, just to name a few. So I mentioned that San Bernard started out as a German community in 1874, was just a stone's throw from San Bernard were the campuses of Samuel Houston College, and then the campus of Tillotson College. Samuel Houston was a Methodist school associated with the Methodist Episcopal Church. Tillotson was founded by Dr. George Tillotson, who was a white missionary, I want to say missionary, but a white minister involved with the Congregationalist Church, and looking for a campus that the society could purchase so that they could found a school to train Black women to be teachers, and also train Blacks on the trades. Also, too, these campuses, and so that's how Tillotson campus was founded, Tillotson College in 1881. And also, too, with these Black colleges that were founded, many of them had elementary schools and even a high school component as well. And many of these campuses also train Black men and women to be teachers, to be educators. There are many of the early graduates of Samuel Houston and Tillotson colleges went on to higher positions at other Black colleges in the South and in the nation. And they also continued their education by going north to integrated schools in the north. So that you had a number of teachers and administrators who were educated at Columbia University, educated at Stanford University, educated, Yale and other integrated universities in the north, and they came south to come back south and to educate. So like I said, Samuel Houston College and Tillotson colleges were no exception at all to that. So many of the teachers who taught my mother and my father, they grew up in East Travis County, they grew up out in the country. They went to little Black country schools. They were taught by teachers who would have been educated at perhaps Samuel Houston College or Tillotson College.
Mm.
Go ahead. Someone has a question.
Oh, I guess I just was wanted to mention real quick that I guess we sometimes take a little bit of a break between our forum and a meeting for worship at 11. So I just wanted to give you a heads up that maybe, just maybe sort of in a few minutes, it might be nice to sort of have a little break before our meeting for worship.
Okay. I sure would like to talk. I sure would like to meet again and talk. Please invite me back to do this.
Please.
Because it's just that there's just so much rich history, and it's integral. It's not just Black history; it's Austin's history as well. And I think it's important that we know about this history. But yes, I will wrap it up. The formation of St. James Episcopal Church, which the meeting house is in the building that used to be St. James Episcopal Church. And by the way, thank you folks for allowing us to rent from you in that year that we were trying to get our church built, and we were not ready with our church. So after we sold it to you all were gracious enough to allow us to stay there for another year while we got our act together. And I please want you all to come out and see our church and feel welcome at any of our services. Racially integrated, multicultural church. It was one of the things that attracted me to St. James when I was 19 years old back in 1974. And St. James Church, by the way, was formed in 1951 because there were two other Episcopal churches in the city, St. David's and All Saints, and they did not give Blacks the red carpet treatment. And so it was formed by educators and some other concerned Black Austinites who had been educated in the North, who taught at either Samuel Houston or Tillotson College, and they had been Episcopalians. And so they wanted an Episcopal form of worship that would satisfy the needs of African Americans. So they petitioned the bishop of the Episcopal Diocese of Texas at the time to organize a church here in Austin. And so the bishop engaged a Black priest from Tyler, Texas, who was the pastor, the rector of St. John the Baptist in Tyler, to come down to Austin once a month and provide Holy Communion for Black parishioners here. St. James held its first services on December 7th, 1941. The original name for the church was the Church of the Advent. Advent means new beginnings. So it was a new beginning in so many ways, not only for Black Episcopalians here and for racial integration here in Austin, but a new chapter in Austin's history. And Church of the Advent grew. By 1947, it became St. James Episcopal Church. We were on East 7th Street down from Houston Tillotson College, which had merged in 1952. And then we moved to your building in 1970. And we were there until we were able to get into our building in 2008. So yeah. So there is a connection with the Friends, with the Quakers, yes.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Harrison Upright, for being with us this morning. It's been just absolutely fascinating to hear this history, and we would absolutely love to have you back. And so we'll certainly be in touch with you about that.
Okay, well, please do, because I want to get a little deeper into it and, you know, really kind of flesh it out more about the Negro District, how it came to be. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
All right. Bye-bye.